Gwinuis le Falcheroiv Goler Gudi on beside Naheran. Hello everybody, I'm Adrian O'Neill and I serve as the Ambassador of Ireland to the United Kingdom, and it is my honour and great pleasure to introduce this year's T.S. Eliot Lecture from the Embassy of Ireland in London. I extend a very warm welcome to my guests today, the award-winning actor Sinead Cusack, who will read an Eliot poem chosen for the occasion, Andrew O'Hagan, the novelist, editor and visiting professor at King's College London, who will later speak in conversation with his close friend, the esteemed author Edna O'Brien. Before their conversation, Edna will first deliver the annual T.S. Eliot address. I also wish to thank Claire Rehill, who manages the T.S. Eliot estate, and without whom we would not all be gathered here today. While my guests and I are here together at the Embassy, we are nevertheless adhering to the necessary social distancing restrictions. In the normal course of event, this lecture would of course be taking place in the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. Unfortunately, coronavirus precludes this happening in 2020. Nevertheless, I'm delighted that, in metaphorical terms at least, we are still on Irish soil at the Embassy of Ireland in Grosvenor Place in London. The T.S. Eliot Lecture is focused on the impact of his work on modern literature and culture. The poet Paul Muldoon launched the series in 2016. Former US Ambassador to the United Nations Samantha Power delivered the address in 2017, followed by Professor Steven Pinker, Chair of Psychology at Harvard. Last year, the lecture was delivered by the artist Sean Scully. While today we are marking its 50th year, the T.S. Eliot estate-sponsored lecture series actually has its genesis some 80 years ago. In the year following the death of W.B. Yeats, the Friends of the Irish Academy organised the first annual lecture in his memory. They invited T.S. Eliot to present the keynote address at the Abbey Theatre. Eliot, an admirer of Yeats, readily agreed. In that lecture at the Abbey Theatre, Eliot said of the recently deceased Yeats, "He was one of those few poets whose history is the history of their own time, who are part of the consciousness of an age, which cannot be understood without them." In many ways, the characterization is also true of today's honoured writer and lecturer, Edna O'Brien. Edna first came to prominence with the publication of her novel, The Country Girls. The book's protagonists, two close but competitive female friends who leave their homes in the west of Ireland for new lives in Dublin and subsequent novels, London, they very much embodied the consciousness of an age, especially as experienced and perceived by young women. Edna has since authored more than 20 books, including Girl, published to critical acclaim last year. Her body of work goes beyond fiction to include plays, children's books, biographies, poetry, and a memoir. Reflected in all those works is the voice of a talented and prolific storyteller, one who has sought and articulated compelling narratives and compassionate testaments of human nature in all our shared complexity, fragility, and capacities for both cruelty and kindness. Edna has lived for many decades here in London. Her work and her life reflects the sensibility of an artist who imaginatively binds our two islands and is revered on both sides of the Irish Sea, as manifested in the honour conferred on her by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and the award to her by President Higgins of the President's Distinguished Service Award. Apart from the T.S. Eliot Lecture itself, we are also celebrating Edna's birthday, a very significant occasion, not only for her, but also for Irish arts and letters. A birthday which will provoke a genuine sense of widespread respect and affection across the Irish Sea. So, happy birthday, Edna. Before Edna shares with us her lecture, I would first like to welcome a good friend back to the embassy, Sinead Cusack. Sinead will get us into the Elliot mood by reading one of his early poems, Rhapsody on a Windy Night. Guramila Mahagav Galer.
Rhapsody on a Windy Night. 12 o'clock. Along the reaches of the street, held in a lunar synthesis, whispering lunar incantations dissolved the flaws of memory and all its clear relations, its divisions and precisions. Every street lamp that I pass beats like a fatalistic drum, and through the spaces of the dark, midnight shakes the memory as a madman shakes a dead geranium. 1:30. The street lamp sputtered, the street lamp muttered, the street lamp said, "Regard that woman who hesitates towards you in the light of the door that opens on her like a grin. You see the border of her dress is torn and stained with sand, and you see the corner of her eye twists like a crooked pin. The memory throws up high and dry a crowd of twisted things. A twisted branch upon the beach, eaten smooth and polished, as if the world gave up the secret of its skeleton, stiff and white. A broken spring in a factory yard, rust that clings to the shape that the strength has left, hard and curled and ready to snap. 2:30. The street lamp said, "Remark the cat which flattens itself in the gutter, slips out its tongue and devours a morsel of rancid butter. So the hand of a child slipped out and pocketed a toy that was running along the quay. I could see nothing behind that child's eye. I have seen eyes in the street trying to peer through lighted shutters, and a crab one afternoon in a pool, an old crab with barnacles on his back, gripped the end of a stick which I held him. 3:30. The lamp sputtered. The lamp muttered in the dark. The lamp hummed. Regard the moon. La lune ne garde aucune rancune. She winks a feeble eye. She smiles into corners. She smooths the hair of the grass. The moon has lost her memory. A washed-out smallpox cracks her face. Her hand twists a paper rose that smells of dust and old cologne. She is alone with all the old nocturnal smells that cross and cross across her brain. The reminiscence comes of sunless dry geraniums and dust in crevices, smells of chestnuts in the streets, and female smells in shuttered rooms, and cigarettes in corridors, and cocktail smells in bars. The lamp said, 4 o'clock. Here is the number on the door. Memory. You have the key. The little lamp spreads a ring on the stair. Mount. The bed is open. The toothbrush hangs on the wall. Put your shoes at the door. Sleep. Prepare for life. The last twist of the knife.
I have heard the mermaids sing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back when the wind blows the water, white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea. Away, away, the spell of arms and voices calling, the white arms of the roads, their promise of close embraces, and the black arms of the tall ships that stand against the moon. O life, O life. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. Paris in the 20s, that sizzle of excitement, inventiveness, audaciousness. The legends abound. Cubists, symbolists, surrealists, poets, Kabbalists, painters, dancers, fledgling writers and highwaymen, all jostling for ascendancy. Yet one encounter has gone by almost unnoticed. The meeting of two men who would become the Leviathans of the 20th century. It was August 17th, 1920. In fact, three men sat down in Hotel de Lycée on the left bank on the Rue de Beaune, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, and Wyndham Lewis. Elliot and Lewis had traveled that day by train, then by boat in another train from London to Paris, bearing a gift from Ezra Pound, who fostered his young prodigies with aggressive, enthusiastic panache. Joyce had made the short walk with his son Giorgio, who was chafing at being there at all. Joyce sat and stared impassively at the brown paper parcel tied with a vexing abundance of knots, the gift. None of the trio carried a penknife, so a knife had to be procured from the kitchen. And when the parcel was opened, Joyce was not enraptured. The gift was a pair of worn brown shoes, which he contemplated, but he did not try them on, and gave them to his son to take home. Noted for his largesse, Joyce invited the visitors to dinner in a nearby restaurant. A fourth man, an art critic of Petit Parisien, joined them. The evening bristled. Joyce was arrogant, excoriating, and sure of his territory. Eliot was tentative, the scion of Plymouth Pilgrims and an adherent of Emerson's strict precepts. Joyce hailed from a feckless family, feckless, who moved dwellings by night when they did not have the money for the rent. His mother bore 17 children, 8 or 9 of which survived, no one was certain. And on her deathbed, her husband told her to die and be done with it. Joyce, the putative and subversive poet at that time, with a splinter of coldness inside his heart, sat in their little garden after her death and read her husband's long-ago love letters to her in case they were of use for fiction. They weren't. His brother Stanislaus helped him to burn them. Wyndham Lewis was a pugnacious man who saw himself, named himself, as the English Picasso, and he relished the evident tension that prevailed between Joyce and Eliot. He had painted Eliot, whom he was a little in love with, referred to him as an apparition with a Gioconda smile. But of course, the premier poet of the Anglo-Saxon race. Eliot fumed at the fact that Joyce did not address him directly, merely inquiring via Lewis, "Does your friend Mr. Eliot like wine, or would your friend Mr. Eliot care for some oysters?" and so on, which Eliot found demeaning. At one point, Joyce actually addressed Eliot directly, just once. He said, "I was out this morning and I said hello to your friend the hippopotamus." Hardly a compliment, as it was one of Eliot's lesser achievements. "I saw the potamus take wing, ascending from the damp savannas, and choiring angels round him sing the praise of God in loud hosannas." So why do I group them together? I group them together because both men determined and succeeded in making the leap. Now, what is the leap? It is what Jung insisted as being essential in psychology and equally relevant to art. The leap seizes strange and unseasonable potencies with which to act upon a person and move him, not her, there was no her mentioned, as if upon the wings of night, from the level of common humanity to that of a more personal and utterly intense experience. It is a violent passion for creation, an acceptance of the price that has to be paid by the artist, by both being in life and outside of life. It goes beyond the frontiers of the normal to that fragile membrane where conscious and subconscious collide. It is dangerous, yes, dangerous. And in its suddenness, not unlike the first wayward sparks when fire was first created by the rapid rubbing just of two stones. That's the leap. It is a pity for us and for them that neither Eliot or Joyce gave thought to the mutinous and lonely spirit of the other. They were unable. Both were embroiled in an urgency to give voice to their deepest thoughts, their deepest feelings, to the blizzards of language that had not existed before. Ancient mariners, but on different ships. At that time, Joyce was working on Oxen of the Bleeding Sun, as he called it, which he reckoned he had spent 1,000 hours already on. Joyce had written a pastiche of several styles with arcane vocabulary, Irish, Anglo-Saxon, Elizabethan, and gob talk. 2 years later, T.S. Eliot, on reading that chapter, said he wished for his own sake he had not read it, because it exposed the futilities of all style. "You think he is as proud as Lucifer?" Lewis asked the moment he and Eliot were alone. "I would not say Lucifer," the ever-cautious Eliot replied. and then carped at Joyce's fake politeness. After you, no, after you, I insist. And Lewis, in a bilious memoir, a mere 2 years later, would also write of Joyce as the poet of shabby, genteel, impoverished, intellectual life in Dublin, with his circumscribed despair going from the pub to the pawn shop, and his bog-trotting humbug. Referring to Joyce's great story, The Dead, he described it as a work of futile culture that involved a supper party and some dancing. The next day, Elliot and Joyce took a short trip into the countryside of Paris and Belgium, during which Elliot received a dotty, a customary letter, from his wife, Vivian Haigwood. My dear Wonky Penske, I have had in all 2 wires and 1 postcard from you. I must know where you are. I must know where you are. I went to my room despairing and cried and called your name. If only you would write a postcard. Cautious people occasionally do impulsive things. To everyone's surprise, and in retrospect, to the groom in particular, T.S. Eliot and Vivian Haigwood had been married in a registry office in Hampstead on July 26, 1915. It happened to be the same day as when her brother was called up to the front. Eliot had been due to sail home to New England, having completed his year's study at Merton College, Oxford. And his pious mother, with her gift of prescience, saw that wedding as unfortunate. His businesslike father saw it as the added ruin to his son, poetry being the primary ruin. Elliot and Vivian that day both signed no occupation on the registry form, and both were virginal. He had only met Vivian a few months before, this flamboyant, impulsive girl with the touch of the siren, who was, as he said, a pliant dancer. Their 2 witnesses at the wedding were a friend of hers, Lucy Thayer, and an aunt. Her parents had not been informed about it. She had been engaged twice before, once to a teacher whom her mother warned off, describing her own daughter as morally insane. Her second fiancé, an American, Schofield Thayer, began to see her as perhaps a bit too madcap. So she wrote him a scolding letter, saying that by jilting her, he had swapped pure yellow diamond for a stained glass window. She had vowed to Ezra Pound that she personally, would save Eliot for England and for poetry. And her influence in certain sections of the wasteland is undoubted. To Eliot, the marriage was a mystery, the accident of a dreaming moment. He could never explain it, except by saying that an inner rebellion seethed within him, that he'd had to make himself into a machine, saying, the year of my marriage, I deliberately died. Eliot had a dread of intimacy, a locked or smothered remembrance of the fetid smell of woman, and an inclination towards 2 archetypes, one with the evanescence of a virgin, and the other, the one he had married, a replica of Edward Monk's Madonna, who is a Lilith-like tempting creature. Within 3 weeks of marriage, they had had their first guest, Bertrand Russell, to whom Vivian openly confessed that she could not succeed in stimulating her husband Tom, while Tom, from the other end of the table, looked on, listless and beautiful. Bertrand Russell thought her pretty, a trifle vulgar, but clearly available. And before long, he was showering her with gifts, silk underwear, and lessons for ballet classes. "Bertie's all over me," she wrote in confidence to a friend. So for Elliot, in a small flat in London, Vivian's escalating moods, a job in Lloyd's Bank, which he found an abomination. It was home to the Whirlpools. They soldiered on, embattled by Vivian's illnesses, her intermittent stays in sanatoriums, and his distinct acceptance of his failure as a husband. But he had not completely forfeited his saint's dream of becoming a poet. So he duplicated his bank clerk in the bowler hat, who walked those streets at lunch hour in London with Dante in one pocket and Baedeker in the other. Sometimes blind Tiresias as a ghost companion, descending an unlit step of stairs, walking among the dead and the living. The dead that included Zionists weeping by the waters of Babylon, the raped Philomel crying her jug, jug, jug to dirty ears, and Aeneas reading a disconsolate letter to Dido. Eliot was every man and no man. Our thoughts are untamed. We think in random, wayward, inconsistent, ramshackle ways. And Eliot, the poet, instinctively realized this, and yet gave to his poetry a flawless unity. He chose his words with a surgical precision. The words had clarity, but also an undercurrent of hallucination, of mystery, of unknownness. We are kept suspended throughout. Are we in Richmond, London, Highbury, or Kew? Is it the London we know, or does it have the dislocatedness of a dream? He casts his spells in broken language, whirling, obsessive, confounding, and always through indirection. He moves through time, personal time, historical time, and mythic time. The poem conveys the unsettling effect of being written by a ghost. Sing softly, till I end my song. As with Joyce, he unconsciously knew what was happening in physics, in science, in mathematics, the breaking up of existing laws and norms to form a world jangled, complex, and at revolution. Eliot noted everything. The unshaven Eastern merchants with a little bag of currants in their pocket, the river sweating oil and tar, the dory fishermen lying on the wharfs, red sails, that curve of bay where Elizabeth and Leicester once plied their oars languidly. He easily imagined the sadness of a dingy room where the typist hung her combinations on the windowsill for the sun's last rays, the callow clerk joyless, arriving for copulation on bed or divan, and sometimes with an aching sweetness. He could hear the whining of a mandolin from a public bar in Lower Thames Street. The visions always clashing. The Hofgarten, a hyacinth girl, the gold Ionian columns of the Church of Magnus Martyr, and brown fog, London brown fog, that licked the window panes at evening time. A game of chess, the second section of The Wasteland, is him at his most audacious and bedeviled. It is a poem about couplings, starting with Cleopatra, who is not named, in a room filled with the smell of oils and unguents, waiting for her ravished love, Mark Antony. Philomel's Jug Jug, Cry Again, which Eliot had taken from a poem by John Lyly, a poet and scholar. Moving to the shriek of an ignored and desperate wife in a voice that must have been the voice of Vivian Haigwood. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What? Thinking what? I never know what you are thinking. Think. I think we're in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing. Again, nothing. You know nothing, you see nothing. Do you remember nothing? I remember those are the pearls that were his eyes. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? Vivian had sworn she would make Elliot a great poet for England and herself. And she found the recklessness to force a moment to its crisis. She brought out the recklessness in him and made no secret of it. She said, as for Tom, I am Tom's mind. I am his mind. We are interchangeable. The Faustian pact was being lived out. Reading that section of The Wasteland is like blundering into a marital séance where deep chasm is matched by an undeclared, awful dependence. Great poetry such as this comes at a price, when crisis and fate collide. It is true of all Greek drama. It is not necessary or even appropriate to examine each word. Who said what? Which is which? The essential emotions are all there. The wife's longing to be heard, her fear of desertion, an inherent, unspoken revenge, and the husband's strategy of evasion. Nothing. Zeal and ennui battled within Eliot. He would come home from work each evening and open the notebook at the page turned down from a previous attempt. He feared he would never finish the poem, never. His mother Charlotte, his adored mother Charlotte, his sister and brother decided to visit London, as they had not seen Elliot in many years, and to allow for their comfort, husband and wife vacated the flat so that the travellers could enjoy their visit and have some peace. Vivian had sworn to behave well. And then on the last night, at supper, they were all around the table. She began to shout and scream, saying she wanted to escape and not sit with buttoned-up Americans. And throughout, Elliot remained silent, hopeless, helpless. His mother already had noticed he was afraid of his wife. And after the visitors left for America, Elliot collapsed. It was the first, though not the last, of his unraveling. Now both himself and his wife were close to breakdown. He took 3 weeks vacation from Bank, and though normally a thrifty person, he booked a room in the Albemarle Hotel at Margate. Vivian left after a few short days, but not before she procured for Tom a gift, the gift of a mandolin, in the hope it might re-inspire him. Each morning, he walked down to a bench in a bus shelter overlooking the chalk cliffs of Margate and wrote and wrote and wrote. And from 100 or more lines, he retrieved these 11 lines. On Margate sands I can connect nothing with nothing. The broken fingernails of dirty hands. My people, humble people, who expect nothing. I need a nerves man, he finally conceded. And the nerves man was a Dr. Vitos who was based in Lausanne and who served both as a mystic and shaman to Eliot. His methods were eccentric, a very long way from Freud's talking cure. A devout Catholic, he specialized in meditation, yoga, and Buddhism. He had published a treatment on neurasthenia by means of brain control. And for Eliot, he proved to be the winged messenger. His healing involved the laying on of hands, visualizations, and eye exercises. He would invite Eliot to envisage numbers and then delete them, then gradually moving to a single line, which he would also have to delete. And these instructions, just by their very simplicity and by their repetitiveness, reduced the clamor of the mind within. Eliot even believed that Dr. Vitos had drawn out these assailants of thought, had flung them as though by means of a magic lantern onto an external, useless screen. He walked up the hill to his pension with a better stride, more hope. And the words came. The words came back. The words he had wanted. He who could not endure a single outside noise used to stop even to hear a choir of children singing in the church grounds. And in the little pension, sitting on his bed with a pencil and copybook, he knew he had broken free. His imagination was on fire. It took him to a wholly alien landscape. It reads like poetry, written by a person within life who had experienced death. We're in a dystopian world, dry sand, dry earth, rock where no water has lodged. The poet, pilgrim poet, journeying through a humped silence, past cracked mud houses, trampled graves, empty chapels, empty cisterns in drought. And combining Sanskrit with English the Sanskrit words chosen for their acoustic effect. The poem broke with past imagery to another world, a cosmic world, where the god of thunder presides and can be called upon and be invoked to bring rain. His cries are fused with Sanskrit words, an extension of da, meaning da, which means to give, to davadyam, which is to sympathize, and finally to damyata, meaning to control. They were self-forgetting moments for the poet, replaced with this new radical sensibility, a fearlessness. When he asks, though, rain does not come. Instead, the expected bounty of the god of thunder will bring self-knowledge, and that only. Dayadavam, the next command, did bode sympathy. Yes, sympathy. But what do we get? And what do we find? Is the pilgrim still the pilgrim, housed in his human prison, who does hear the key turn in the door at nightfall, but his freedom is apocryphal, just as it had been for the broken Coriolanus. Damyata suggests a journey, but that journey is one of self-control again. There is indeed a boat, the sea is calm, the boatman is gaily beating the oars to an intended destination, and the destination proves to be what he once and always knew. London Bridge falling down, the Prince of Aquitaine arrived at his abolished tower, and old Hieronymus mad again. Life, as for Sisyphus, repeating itself endlessly. Yeats, in later years, said that for him, gaiety transcended all his dread. But for Eliot, transcendence was the martyr's cry, the hair short. It is a puzzling, tragic poem which inspired Ted Hughes to name Eliot the purest, the most authentic poet of all. Conrad Aiken, a friend of Eliot's, said it was a microscopic divine comedy, a kind of epic, in a walnut shell, elaborate, ordered, dramatic, lyrical, acknowledging its genius and also a tyrannous awareness of the world around him. And so that analytic brain approached its task with the dissecting of life and the great detachment of a surgeon. And if I had been asked, in what other realm of art does the wasteland resemble, I would say Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson. Because that is what it is. It's an anatomy lesson, and therefore a human lesson. As a critic, Eliot himself came to be named the Undertaker. And George Steiner, in his monumental collection of essays, Language and Silence, noted Eliot's peevish assumption of superiority, saying he lacked the warmth and munificence of his friend Virginia Woolf, and even the opulent gems scattered here and there in the pages of the irascible Mr. Nabokov. Many authors, fell under Eliot's sword. Matthew Arnold was distressingly vague. D.H. Lawrence consumed with spiritual sickness, driving a commonplace man. And Baudelaire, according to Eliot doctrine, would be nothing. He'd be nothing without his morbidity. Of his work, Eliot said Baudelaire was perverse, insufferable, mulish, disorderly, and a poet who did not transcend the struggle to spirituality or the consecrated task of sincerity. But it's when he turns to Shakespeare that Eliot reveals his more ignoble impulses. The sonnets lacked a sustaining metaphor. Shakespeare could not drag them into art or into light. Hamlet is an artistic failure, the Mona Lisa of literature, dominated by an emotion that is superfluous and inexpressible. So is Eliot. He says Hamlet is puzzling, disquieting, full of inconsistency scenes, the entire play representing a crisis in the playwright's life. And he had the humility to confess to Ian Foster that perhaps there was an element of bluffing in his criticism. And then, rather surprising for him, he admitted that he had been too avid of his fame as a critic. And so he turned to playwriting. Eliot's first two short dramatic monologues, fragments of a prologue and fragments of an agon, are short, gleeful works. The action takes place in a seedy dive where two good-time girls, Doris and Dusty, preen themselves and await gentlemen callers. Sweeney, the principal character, is a strutting knave with the fistic parlance of a cockney gangster. I knew a man once did a girl in, Sweeney declares to Doris, who recoils at the idea she has just cut the cards before he came and drew the coffin. Well, what does it matter? She's his island girl. She's his to gobble up. I'll carry you off to a cannibal isle. You'll be the cannibal. You'll be the missionary. I'll gobble you up. I'll be the cannibal. You'll carry me off to a cannibal isle. I'll be the cannibal. I'll be the missionary. I'll convert you. I'll convert you into a stew. A nice little white little missionary stew. You wouldn't eat me. Yes, I'd eat you. In a nice little white, little soft, little tender, little juicy little missionary stew. You see this egg? You see this egg? Well, that's life on the Crocodile Isle. There's no telephones, there's no gramophones, there's no motor cars, no two-seaters, no six-seaters, no Citroen, no Rolls-Royce. Nothing to eat but the fruit as it grows. Nothing to see but the palm trees one way and the sea the other. Nothing to hear but the sound of the surf. Nothing at all but three things: birth and copulation and death. That's all. Birth and copulation and death. Vivian Haig-Wood saw a production and wondered why she had not fainted and been carried out. Eliot's later plays are more serious, but they lack the necessary danger. They lack the knife. It is impossible to believe that the man who gave us these impeccable poems, that showering of imagery, May hedges in voluptuary whiteness, rituality, and much multiplicity of feelings, could be one and the same person as he who wrote Family Reunion, which is a lumbering, lugubrious work. Malcontented people bleat on about each other and the English weather. There's more passion on one page of Chekhov than in the 126 pages of this work. But it is not Chekhov Eliot sought to emulate. It is the Greeks. He wished the work to have the scope and the gravity of the Oresteia, but the inner compulsion is not there. Eliot admitted to that and his own problems with writing it and his own failure with it. Because years later, when he spoke of it, he spoke Oh, the terror within, which perhaps belongs to the imagination of the poet rather than the imagination of the playwright. Redeem the time, redeem the time. In Ash Wednesday, Eliot has moved back to poetry and has moved on from the secular to the liturgical. It is a work of atonement, a hymn, a plea for mercy to a white-robed lady who walks between the violet and the violet. He had reached a point where stylistic splendor is secondary to religious avowal. And pray to God have mercy upon us, and I pray that I may forget those matters that with myself I too much discuss. Eliot's conversion to the Anglo-Catholic Church in 1927, and 9 months later taking confession and a vow of chastity, changed the poet and changed the man. It also changed his marriage. For the first time, the secret, dutiful son wrote to his mother to confide. One of the greatest mistakes of his life, he said, had been his wife's invalidism. She had not told him before marriage that she had had tuberculosis of the bones as a young child and been prescribed narcotics and various drugs, which she became addicted to. No sooner was she recovered from bronchitis than she got influenza, which developed into pneumonia. Her digestive organs were awry, and many times she was expected not to live, hence reduced to a skeleton. Taking care of her was the paralysis in his life, and the result, not of a single moment, but of a whole past. None of their mutual friends liked her. But to Middleton Murray, knowing that she once had held a small niche in his heart, she wrote saying, "I want to cut free. Run, run, run. I want air, but if I have air, will he love me? We are lonely with each other." Except he did not love her any longer, and she no longer wanted to run. It was against this backdrop on the stairs of existence, as he said, that stairs which wore the deceitful faces of hope and love, that he wrote Ash Wednesday, a poem by which he was seeking a rebirth of the spirit. The exquisite phrasing, the mastering music, it's all there. There's also a quiet, a severity, such as he admired in the work of Dante, and had come to the conclusion to be more humble, more solitary, and more nakedly imploring of the divine. In an essay on Dante, he tells of the strangest transfixing dream. A woman came to Dante, and this is how it's described: olive-crowned over a white veil, a lady appeared to me, and my spirit, without further knowledge, by my eyes, felt through the hidden power which went out from her, the great strength of an old love. As soon as the lofty power struck my sense, which already had transfixed me before my adolescence, I turned leftwards to say to Virgil, "Hardly a drop of blood in my body does not shudder. I know the tokens of the ancient flame." The ancient flame was a former sweetheart, to whom he had sworn love 13 years previously, the night before he sailed for England. This was Emily Hale. To his astonishment, Elliot received one morning a letter from Emily Hale, with whom he had not corresponded since his marriage, telling him that she was assistant professor of vocal teaching at Downer College in New England, and in her mannerly way asking if he could send her any advice which would be of enormous help to her students. Soon the correspondence flourished, and Emily Hale received weekly letters in blue envelopes with lines from Ash Wednesday, drawings of jeweled unicorns and gilded hearses. It is when Eliot in that poem glides from worship to bestiality that the poem catches fire. He does it with his customary verve, almost with a nonchalance, as if he is offering her the key to the sacred tabernacle. Lady, 3 white leopards sat under a juniper tree in the cool of the day, having fed to satiety. On my legs, my heart, my liver, and that which had been contained in the hollow round of my skull. And God said, shall these bones live? Shall these bones live? And that which had been contained in the bones which were already dry said, chirping, because of the goodness of this lady and because of her loveliness and because she honors the Virgin in meditation, we shine with brightness. So the bones, even the bones, are shining with brightness. Worship alone would not have made Ash Wednesday remarkable. It is that moment of gleeful gorging in which Eliot reaches into his savage self, defying expectation. It is like imagination doing a somersault and brought to its innate, though concealed, madness. It is reckless, it is urgent, it is the poet exceeding his boundaries. And it seems so fresh to the ear, as if the ink has never dried upon the page. To what purpose, we have to ask, did he wish to tell the lady, the sacred lady, of this orgy, and then of bones being tossed about with song? He claimed it was to find forgiveness, which is strange, since he, the poet, is the one who is being eaten. Eliot had always spoken of sins too terrible to relay, and always spoken of a lady who would in time come to give him absolution. The absolution as such came with an invitation to take a professorship at Harvard for 1 year, so that his pursuit of the lady could be combined both with the heavenly of his poetry and the earthly loveliness. By then, Emily Hale had a post temporary, California, to which Eliot traveled specially, yes, specially, in order to speak to her students on the lovely poetry of Edmund Lear. They are meeting on a railway station at dawn. Emily, now much more groomed and composed, contrasted with Eliot in a dark suit, unkempt, unslept, shy, but with all the suspense and augury of great Russian fiction. Love on the page is not love in reality. Eliot wanted to fabricate something permanent and holy out of personal animal feelings, whereas Emily Hale hoped for marriage. But Vivian was still there in London, hatching her manic, assiduous plans, outraged when his solicitor served her with the deed of separation, which she refused to sign. His homecoming was shrouded in secrecy, staying in small hotels or lodgings. The staff at Faber stringently instructed to get rid of her, to say they had not seen him. And yet he feared the eerie powers of her clairvoyance, believing she would find him. Yes, she would come upon him suddenly in one of those streets or side streets, in her black cape, which she now wore as a gesture to fascism. Apart from going to Faber, she went to his dentist surgery, to the passport office, because she believed he was being kidnapped. She attempted to place an advertisement in the Times. Will T.S. Eliot please return to his flat at Clarence Gate, as he has been missing since September. And she had this ongoing hallucination in which he was being beheaded. Yes, beheaded, which meant she at least had his mind to hold on to. Meanwhile, back in America, Emily Hale was weaving and unweaving her expiring narrative. They still met when she came to Europe in the summers. They spent time at Burn Norton. And yet again, she would be inscribed in poetry, except that the rapture is more evasive and the happiness more fleeting. Time and the bell bury the day. The black cloud carries the sun away. Will the sunflower turn to us? Will the clematis stray down, bend to us, tendril and spray, clutch and cling? Weary with waiting, her impeccable Boston restraint failed her, and she too had a breakdown. There is something noble and poignant about Eliot's last time when he and Vivian would meet. It was at a books exhibition organized by the Sunday Times in Dorland Hall. Vivian arrived dressed in fascist uniform, black shirt, black beret, black raincoat. She had brought their little dog, Poppy, along. As Elliot came down the aisle, he heard her, "Oh, Tom," and he stopped, shook her hand and said loudly, for everyone to hear, "How do you do?" He went on stage, kept his composure, and spoke, Vivian said in her diary, very cleverly. The moment he had finished, she let Poppy off the lead, rushed up with books to be signed, the scorned wife asking for her husband's autograph. Meanwhile, Poppy was overjoyed, showing the same astonishment and recognition as Argos had shown to Odysseus in the Odyssea. The master had returned. And then there followed a moment, not of madness, but of pure heartbreak. "Will you come home with me?" Vivian asked. "I can't talk now," Elliot said, and hurried away. They would not meet again. Vivian's brother Morris and doctors who had been treating her were the ones to authorize her admission to a mental institution. which Eliot had to give his signature to. It seems she went quietly in the end when 3 women, nurses, had been talking to her for hours and hours in the hallway, persuading her that it was wisest to go. She was 58 and died of a heart attack in 1947. Her obituary is best perpetuated in the shattered and splintered lines of the wasteland. The 4 quartets are what followed in those 7 punitive years. They are thought to be religious poems and are frequently read at funerals and memorial service. But at their core, they are the cry of a 50-year-old man wrestling with the concerns and agonies of death and birth and time. One feels that in the 7 years of writing them, Eliot might have had the words of Moses in the desert on his own mind. O word, thou word that I lack. It was not that he lacked words, but he felt the one word that might convey the extent of what he was feeling. By being regarded as religious poems is ridiculous. It is to gentrify them. It is to do them an injustice. George Orwell, in a very piqued appraisal of the poem, spoke of them as conscious futility and lectured the poet on the mistake, yes, the mistake, of not dedicating himself to some purpose that was not wholly aesthetic. He went on to say that Eliot did not feel his faith. He assented to it for complex reasons which are not stated. He suggested there were only 3 outlets for a poet, which is either to die young, enter the Catholic Church, or join the Communist Party. Yes, at that time in 1942, England was under bombardment. It raises questions, and will always raise questions, as to what a person should write and who exactly is the adjudicator. Literature should not be dogma. The writer, he or her, should write about what is nascent, what Eliot once called the dark fetus. Burnt Norton is the first movement of those poems. Reading it is like being brought into a chamber of echoes. A landscape is echoed, in which he reveals the delicate, sometimes even nostalgic moments, footfalls in the passage, transitions from what might have been to what has been. A rose garden, the lotus pool filled by sunlight. The verses come gradually, descending into despair, tumid apathy, solicitude, darkness, deprivation, and the way sad times stretching before and after. A person alluding to the unseizable moments, not just for him, but for mankind. With East Coker, the second movement, Eliot returns to where his ancestors had lived for centuries, addressing houses that rise and fall, old stone to new building, the vibrant air sometimes, dahlias asleep in an empty silence, a moment of nearness, a couple coming into a box circle, and gradually the vortex opening. then widening in the poem to an unabashed howl of despair. Oh, dark, dark, dark. They all go into the dark, the vacant interstellar spaces, into the vacant, the captains, merchant bankers, eminent men of letters, the generous patrons of the arts, the statesmen and the rulers, distinguished civil servants, chairmen of many committees, industrial lords, and petty contractors, all go into the dark, and we all go with them into the silent funeral. Nobody's funeral, for there is no one to bury. I said to my soul, be still, and let the darkness come upon you. My favorite of the 4 quartets is Dry Salvages, of which he said, I put myself on the paths of the sea within and the sea without. The sea driven by demonic, chthonic powers, as the poet was during those 7 years of privation. The poem it resembles most for me is The Seafarer, an anonymous 10th century poem preserved in the Book of Exeter, in which it says, the sea took me, swept me back and forth in sorrow and fear and pain, showed me sufferings in 1,000 ships. My feet were cast in icy bands bound with frost, with frozen chains and hunger. Hunger tore at my sea-weary soul. Alone in a world blown clear of love, the roaring sea, the song of the swan. The narrator of The Seafarer does reach deliverance that has been born out of the love of God. But Eliot, the penitent, had not found that. Not yet. But before long, we're plunged into the sea. The stanza is saturated with energy, shock bulletins, images totally, radically independent of one another. And yet this strange, mystifying, believable union. And he was doing something else, something radical, something unexpected. He was questioning creation itself. Who made the world? He couldn't answer. He could only ask, was it God? Or was it gods born out of this nothingness, this slime of the beginnings? For an Anglo-Catholic, that is a subversive thought. That was heresy. To suggest God as an idea, as an invention of man, and as a palliative of man, was grounds for excommunication. And in the last section of the 4 quartets, little Gideon, he is a more contrite man. He speaks of the shame of motives late revealed, of things ill done and done to others' harm, the tendencies by which honor is stained. And history for him is timeless. We are travelers, he is saying. We're all just human travelers. I could not but love T.S. Eliot for this poetry, even if he had never written anything else. The poems were fairly jubilantly received. there was some offense that bafflingly the war had been at bay. But he was reconciled to himself. There would be no more poetry as such. He could not write poetry like that again. He knew he couldn't. The future was a faded song. And he had even given thought of withdrawing to a monastery where he could avoid seeing people. And yet, call it a vision, call it a fairy tale, or call it both. But Eliot was to experience what happened to another great mystic poet in old age. Not old, but he called it old. That other poet was George Herbert, who had said, "And so in age I bud again. And so in age there came a budding within." In Shakespeare's happier plays, and there is happy writing, there's room for everything. Even love has its torments. There is witchery, there is magic potion from plants or trees. There is jealousy, there is the torture of loves briefly parted, and so on. But for Eliot, none of these torments came true. Esme Valerie Elliot, at the age of 14, had a divine vision. She lived in Leeds. She heard a recording by John Gielgud of the Journey of the Magi. And as we all know, it is not a happy or jocular poem. It is a poem of the depths of winter, the weather bad and sharp, the camels sore-footed, and the Magi themselves in extreme doubt, uncertain as to whether what they are following is birth or death, but trudging on towards it. Valerie Elliot, at that moment, claimed, both to her parents and subsequently, that she had actually had a vision. And that vision was that she was necessary to him and that she would serve him. It took many years. She went to university. She applied to Faber and Faber often to see if there were a vacancy. She was turned down, except one day, many years later, she is sitting opposite him in a dingy room, a small Dickensian room, with his chain smoking, his certain inability to interview a secretary or a typist, supposedly to ask her about her training, but in fact, both of them talking of George Herbert, the poet. When she left, he simply said he hoped she would be seeing him again. And so it happened. She became his secretary. She was irreplaceable. She read his needs. She did everything and more. She assembled all the stray talks, lectures, sermons. We do not know when or how or why. We shall never know. When Eliot himself began to thaw. All that we know for certain is that Esme Valerie Elliot built a pair of stairs for each of them to find their way to love, to loving each other. and unknown to all his friends and acquaintances. One morning, they were at a Catholic church, St. Barnabas, at 6:15 in the morning, being married, with as two witnesses, Valerie's parents. Faber and Faber were notified. The couple went on a short honeymoon to the south of France. And for everyone, when they returned, Elliot was, yes, it seems sensational. Elliot was a changed man. They were described being together at the first party that was given for them as being knitted together. 10 years later, Eliot died. His ashes were interred in the local church of St. Michael and the Angels, from where his ancestors had been 2 centuries prior. And there is a plaque to him at Westminster Cathedral. Tennyson nearby, Henry James. And underneath the plaque is a beautiful line of Eliot, with which I hope to conclude my little talk to you. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Thank you all very much.
Hello and welcome. I'm Andrew O'Hagan, and it's my privilege to be talking to Edna O'Brien a few minutes after her 2020 T.S. Eliot lecture. Welcome, Edna, on behalf of the T.S. Eliot estate and the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, and here at all the people at the Embassy of Ireland in London. I'd like to wish you happy birthday and welcome you and congratulate you on that most insightful and incredible and original 2020 lecture that you gave. I mean, that affinity that you have so clearly for T.S. Eliot's poetry, where did that start in your life? Can you remember first reading Eliot's poetry?
I didn't get to books till a little later than is normal, whatever normal is. So I would say I was, when I eloped rather than got married, I had stressed the word. There were books in his house, Ernest Gabler's house. T.S. Eliot was among them, so I would have been 22. And I remember reading Prufrock first and loving it and identifying with it and taking life in a measured manner. Naturally, I graduated from that to the desolation and the mysteriousness. And what I found, which I think most people find, is the inclination in one to learn them by heart,
yes,
to recite them, because they are so powerful on the ear, as well as to the soul, or whatever we call the internal. And I do love them, and I could not love them.
That balancing of light and darkness, which is so central to your own work as a novelist, is something that you might have in common with Eliot. Would you agree? I mean, some novelists have an affinity with a certain poet in the way that Jane Austen did.
Who did she have an affinity
with? Alexander Pope, and Nabokov with Pushkin. And I would say that even if I hadn't heard this wonderful lecture today, I would have imagined that Eliot would have been a writer very close to your work as a novelist.
He would be, but perhaps it's a conceit to say so. But I certainly learned from him and reread him a lot. As a person, I think he would alarm me because I might be a little over-effusive or something that he would not have a liking towards. I often think there are writers, this is stolen from John D. Salinger's book, because I suddenly remember he said it in The Catcher in the Rye. There are writers you'd love to meet, and there are writers you don't want to meet.
Yes.
And I think to read him, not alone for me, but for many people, is probably more gratifying and more profound, because he did build a carapace around himself, and one felt or feels that he would have been judgmental, but that might be a mistake of mine. And to read a person and not know them carries throughout life its own secrecy, and it's inviolate.
Yes.
It cannot be damaged, or by that it cannot be watered down by any little dislike or judgment. It exists, and it's fresh.
We've been talking about the affinity that can exist between writers. You mentioned in your lecture James Joyce and Eliot's meeting and their lack of affinity. What do you think that was about?
Well, they both had their eyes on the throne, that is no doubt about it. And I think, as I said, they both became the Leviathans, not only of their time, but of they're as modern today as when they wrote. They both were at very stressful and painful. Joyce was very happily married to Nora Barnacle.
Yes.
But they were both writing something that was almost beyond their or beyond human ability to achieve. So the inner tension would have been a lot. They both drank. I would have hoped that drink would have made the evening more
great
jocular.
social oil.
But with the presence of Wyndham Lewis, nothing could be jocular.
Wyndham Lewis is a bit of a sort of, not satanic character, but certainly a dark figure in this story.
and meddlesome, and also very small in his appraisal. He was obviously in love with Elliot and was pleased to arriving with these pair of brown shoes that no one, I think, ever wore. Joyce was insulted by them. They probably didn't fit, which is a drawback with shoes.
So you had his son take them away.
Joyce and Elliot did form a friendship, but they were not close friends. They were so different.
Well, one of the things that Eliot said in reviewing Joyce, we're going to stick with Joyce for a minute because here we are in the Embassy of Ireland, so it's almost an obligation. But Eliot, when he reviewed Ulysses, he used the word futility. And of course, that was the same word that decades later, as you point out in your lecture, that George Orwell used.
Yes, they both used it. They both used it. Eliot did say so in the Dial magazine that that Ulysses had exposed the futility of mankind along with other things. Orwell, I'm sure, had read what Eliot said. Yes. Orwell, whom I admire, and of course I do. I think he was quite hard on Eliot. On The Wasteland, he admired what he called its glowing despair. Well, at least he put glowing in. But he felt, because of being a Marxist, that everything should conform to the Marxist concept, which is narrowing. His books are not narrow, his books are amazing. But I don't think for any writer or critic or friend to suggest either the theme or the nature of a work of art, not of a dud work, but a work of art. I don't think it's their right or their intelligence or their privilege to take. They can be against a book, they can dislike it, but to question the theme of a work or question the sincerity of an author, if it happens to be good, and in these cases it happened to be great, to question that is a meanness of spirit.
In your handling of Ash Wednesday and the Four Quartets, you brilliantly enter into an engagement with where that savagery and that viscerality that you've identified in Eliot's poetry comes from. And a lot of it is to do with his personal relationships. You mentioned Vivian, you talk about Emily Hale, and more happily later, you speak of Valerie. Could you just give our audience a sense of that relationship difficulty you think is pushing him the whole time?
Oh yes, it was pushing him. Everything that happened to him was a force became within him. I would think, and it will never be known, I would think the anger and savagery, as I have called it, and you have named it as well, began at a much earlier time in his life. I think he came from a very staid upbringing. His mother was, never rule out mothers. His mother was very religious. She wrote what she called poetry, and where in fact you could put them on a holy calendar. They were pious, pointless works. They had no power in them, they had no verve in them. And she once wrote to him and said she regretted that her poetry did not arrive at the eminence of his poetry. She was not jealous of him, she was proud of him, but at the same time she felt neglected or failure poetry, which he deserved to be. They were appalling. She was also a very strict person. I think his whole family were strict. And when he writes about hearing the river, the Mississippi, and then the light showing the bloom that is on grapes, and the circle of colour of a gaslight on a flower, all that is tinged with the nostalgia. But I would say there were earlier things within his life that were warping, and he spoke of the poison that Boston, and he meant the surrounding world of Boston, had instilled in him.
Yes, of course.
But he did not say what that poison was.
But Vivian, you give credit to, as do others, for drawing him towards, if you like,
yes, she had the courage
that allowed him to write
bring
the
a crisis to its force.
Yes.
To bring a crisis to its ultimate, even if it's inimical at the time to the doer. And he both needed that, probably loved having it, and rebelled against it,
yes,
because it took him down from his pedestal.
I mean, there was something he acknowledged himself, which was that marriage was a sort of ending to himself in some ways.
Yes, I killed myself. I died.
It killed him, but yet gave birth.
It made him and it killed him. As I think I said, it was a Faustian pact.
Yes.
There was reward in it, and there was death in it.
Do you think it took a substantial toll on him, as they used to say, as a man? I mean, was he able to function in the world during the years with Vivian? I mean, or was he disabled by that relationship
I think
too?
It's very indelicate to say so, but I think sexually he was not the husband she hoped or desired. I think his mother, as said, he was afraid of her, but I think she was also afraid of him. He was a man of silence, whose anger, the anger of silence, is far more far-reaching and intrepid than the anger of shouting. Neither are great. But I think she felt that he was also came to be revered. His eminence in his life, that photograph of him with a wreath of daisies crown of daisies on his head that Virginia Woolf saw Valerie sitting under.
Yes.
That was displayed somewhere, I forgot where, so I couldn't put in. People were beholden to him. He was revered finally in his own country as well. Vivian was very jealous of that, because she also wrote things not very well. And she felt, and she had a right to feel, that she had a place in the wasteland. Her
Yes.
voice is there, her power is there, and her madness, which allied itself to his secret madness, is there.
So in a sense, it's her legacy too, to whatever degree. The poem couldn't have been what it is without him, and one might also say without Ezra Pound.
Certain parts of his poems could not have been written.
Yes.
The May whisperings of violet light, moving into violet light, could have been written without her. In fact, would have been more easily written without her. But the actual ones where you get the stir, where you get the savagery, why tell a lady of purity about leopards eating you? I mean,
Yes.
that isn't exactly a love remark.
Edna, how do you account for the fact, I mean, in the brief time that we have, for the fact that these three, if we include Proust, these three modernist masters, all obsessed with time and memory, arrive on the scene more or less at the same time? And these are three writers who have mattered to you all your writing life. How do you account for them?
Of having that theme or internal
Having those
theme.
themes and having, as it were, arriving not 100 years apart or 200 years apart, but
but
arriving
all
at that
I see what you
time.
mean, at the same time. That is peculiar. What I would say about it, I think those considerations, fears and themes were resident in everyone. They weren't singular to those three men, but they brought them into the light or into the consciousness of you. Things happen, and in fact Ted Hughes, whom I mention in the poems, in the talk, there's a slip, he believed always that people born around, I was born in the same year as Ted Hughes, for instance, 1930, and he believed that people born in the same time or sometimes in the same location shared, as if through not even thought, through evanescence that could never be explained. They shared certain thoughts. So what was happening to Joyce, to Eliot, and as you say, to Proust, was happening simultaneously, but exclusive to each himself.
Yes. I mean, one might say that the conditions in the world, as it were, the First World War, and as you mentioned beautifully, what's happening in science and social life and the larger economy, that all of these factors also make a Stravinsky, they make a Picasso as well, perhaps, as a Joyce and an Eliot, that the forces that are in the world have an effect in shaping those writers' material.
Yes, one thing just seeps into the other.
Yes.
And the seeping is something that is really, it's untraceable, but it happens.
One of the things
more
that
of it happens.
you
I'm
put
waiting
words
for
on it. I mean, one of the title of this lecture was The Leap.
The Leap.
And there was one quote jumped out, being inside life and outside of it, almost a condition for the first-rate artist, for someone who's going to make that leap. Yes. Do you think that's an essential component of a literary artist at that level?
Oh, the leap is needed. Yes, the leap is needed. And the leap it's not in every second of the poem or the prose or whatever, or whenever to whomever it happens. But it is both a revelation and in its suddenness, it takes the reader by the throat.
Yes.
It's not something one has ever heard of or thought of perhaps before. And Jung, as I quote from at the beginning of that, was the person to give it its identity except he and Freud fell out over it, but Jung gave it its name and its identity in psychiatry and psychoanalysis.
Another point you make is that Eliot was every man and no man, a very striking phrase.
He was so lonely.
Do you think before the latter years, when he was happy with Valerie and he'd found the right person, as it were, to make life work for him, do you think he was lonely and unhappy for many of the decades before that?
Oh, totally. That's why he needed seclusion. That's why to live in somebody's house for which he paid, to agree to meet at a certain time or point each day and briefly. He was extremely alone. He was alone, I'm sure, when he was handed the Nobel Prize. He was a person of aloneness. He dreaded having had one marriage. He wrote, I didn't put it in my talk, it was too severe, but he wrote of his disgust, his absolute, including disgust, his withheld frenzy of being in the company of others, the sound of others, the chatter of others, the smell of others, the thoughts of others, etc.
It's interesting, the notion of withheld frenzy in a poet who we think of as a very decorous individual in many ways. I mean, characterized as the man in the 14-piece suit. You know, somebody incredibly sort of together and quiet and withheld as a man could have this frenzy.
It must have been almost unendurable to hold a prison, to hold two prisons inside yourself, not to be just indifferent or unaware, but to be absolutely seething permanently and also seething with the kind of divinity or the search for divinity, the clash, the ambiguity of that would send any person not only to Dr. Vitos, but to a lunatic asylum.
And you give his words for that. You describe his mentality. I have to say, describe it with a precision and a bravado that most academics wouldn't be able to muster, Edna. It might take a creative writer to see sometimes what another creative writer is doing. You describe at one point his zeal and ennui that battled inside Eliot. I mean, we know something about the ennui from the poems, but the idea of the zeal too. This was a man who had energy for life also.
Oh, total, and appetite for life, and at the same time distaste for the appetite for life.
Yes.
I think with academics as a reader, I have a few I think that I know, but too bad. I think often in the case of literature, they omit or are fearful or envious or all things, the sap of what belongs in a poem or a novel or a paragraph of a novel. They shy away from it. I mean, with the case of Eliot, I've read, I think, almost everything that was ever said about him. And I think Conrad Aiken, when he talked about the violence within the man, was one of the few who drew attention to it. Academics have, it's to do with everybody thinking on the same railway line or railway track. They either shy from or never had a daring or enough daring, an individuality of person, or they've read too much. You know, you can read too much as well as read too little.
Of course.
They're both bad.
There's a notion in your lecture of Yeats's difference from Eliot.
Transfigured, all that gaiety.
The gaiety transfiguring
all
him.
that dread.
Yes. And that's something that is unimaginable in Eliot's case.
Oh,
Gaiety transfiguring.
oh. You won't get into heaven with gaiety. You'll be kept out.
Now, you're quite tough on Eliot as a critic when he's at his most critical of other writers.
It was terrible.
You feel that that's a low point intellectually for him.
It was a disappointment and a low point and an aberration. To think that Shakespeare couldn't bring his sonnets to the light.
No, you dive to Shakespeare's defence on this occasion.
You'd have to. He did eventually. He, at that lecture, which I hadn't brought the booklet of, in America, in a little booklet that Tom Stopper had loaned me, he spoke of Shakespeare's greatness and of Shakespeare's humanity. He didn't actually refer to his own blunders.
Yes.
He was younger. His ambition was huge because once Virginia Woolf said to him, "You're very hard on Shakespeare," which he, acknowledged. And then she said, Keats read Shakespeare before sleep as if he was reading prayer, which Keats did. Mm-hmm. And she quotes some of Keats, "When from that ignoble forest." So anyhow, it's about the desire to reach Shakespeare in heaven. She said to Eliot, "We will never be as great as Shakespeare." Virginia said, we're not as great as Keats, excuse me. And Eliot said, "Oh yes, we are, because we work harder." Oh, he had his own inner, he had a crown of thorns and he had little inner thorns.
But you have a hard task ahead of you because two of your writers that you swear by, Tolstoy and Eliot, both gave Shakespeare a hard time.
Yes.
And Shakespeare's top of the tree for you, no?
Yes, but it's the aspect of them I do not care for. About everything else, I love them.
Well, Eliot, in your defence, Eliot himself said that as a critic, he had been too avid for fame.
Too avid of fame.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to ask you about the plays because you do touch on them during the lecture, and you feel, it seems, that he often failed as a playwright And you introduce a very curious and interesting idea, which is to wonder, given the circumstances at home or in his private life, if he'd read Ibsen or what it would be like.
He later in life did.
Yes.
He later in life admired Ibsen, but I don't think he can have read Ibsen before the family reunion, or he would have said, let's put this one away. And the the plays of Ibsen that would have been greatest for him would be Little Eyolf and John Gabriel Borkman.
Yes.
Because they are both about remote men with great aspiration who detach themselves from life and from those around them. I don't think he'd have liked Hedda Gabler. Might have been a bit too near the bone.
Lovers of literature who will be watching this and who engage with your work and with Eliot's will respond automatically, I think, to the notion that you gave words to, which is literature should not be dogma. Could you say a little bit more about that? Why is it important to avoid it?
We talk till tomorrow, but we haven't time. I hate dogma. In the Catholic Church, in the Communist Party, in Islamist rhetoric, in all religions. All religions live by dogma. Parents live by dogma, a lot of them. My biggest objection with regards to literature is dogma is the death of literature, because it removes the very spontaneity, the very courage, and the very rawness and newness of what it is that the person is trying to say.
Yes.
Dogma is a blight, it's a virus, and people use it with such, when you think of what happened in Nazi Germany, when you think of how not only books were burned, beautiful works of art stolen and put away, when you think in Russia that after the Bolshevik Revolution and time of Stalin, I have a booklet about 7 Russian poets. 5 of them either were shot, sent to Siberia, or hanged themselves. And that was because of dogma, because the state objected to the nature and theme, above all, and what they were supposed to write about, how brass was wonderful and coal was like opals. They were supposed to toe the line.
Yes.
Dogma kills people.
We're here as guests today of the Embassy of Ireland, so I'll go
Oh
easy.
yes, I better be careful.
Could
that
we,
beautiful piece of brass.
Could we talk about Ireland for a second in relation to dogma? Because it is an interesting question, it seems to me, for a writer like you. Both the childhood, perhaps, where dogma was present,
yes,
both within the family and out within the
everywhere.
society surrounding you.
Everywhere.
But also, dogma came to visit you as a professional writer too. When The Country Girls was treated
I had a bit
roughly.
of trouble.
Yes. So would you talk for a second or two about that? Because I think that given that we've got you, it seems important to touch on that.
Well, I think what it did to me, I'll tell you what it did to me subsequently and what it did to me as it was happening. What it did to me, and maybe this is a terrible trait in my character, it made me seem as a young girl and behave with utter devout religiosity and duty. If a crumb of bread, if I dropped it, if I did the slightest sin, because everything was a sin.
Yes.
Swallowing was a sin. I made particular, I cleared it up. What is the word? Repented for it in one form or another. So when I came to write The Country Girls, which Seamusini used to always laugh about, I always said in public to protect myself, it's just about 2 girls in gem frocks when I was being assailed left, right, and center. I made myself into 2 people. The girl who bows and accedes, and the girl who breaks windows, breaks walls, and shouts. And that, I think, being, if anyone, insofar as anyone can be truly true about themselves, is my nature, and has remained my nature to some extent. Not quite as obviously, we hope, because the dogma was what ruled. and my life depended on it.
Yes.
And I would never, for instance, in the case of I loved a sweet and mortified
Yes.
myself a lot by not touching a bit of chocolate that my mother would have hidden away, but by maybe taking a bite of it. And I remember going to my mother with the full sin of that and how I could both be punished by it and redeemed. So that is, without any exaggeration, in fact, I'm telling you very simple and not necessarily huge things. There were huger things. But that is the nature of how I was brought up, how every girl was brought up, not just me.
But it does, for our purposes, offer such a correlation between you as a writer and Elliot. I know that your instinct is to resist such comparisons, but the lecture was so personal and it drew on you as a woman, as a reader, and as a writer, I think, so strongly. It was the opposite of an academic treatise. It
Maybe
came
too
from
personal.
somewhere very personal, it seemed to me. And it's in that spirit that I ask you about sin and about contrition, as it were, because you locate these things in Eliot. As it were, you mentioned at one point perhaps a heinous sin that existed for him.
Yes, he did speak of sins too numerous to mention and too heinous.
Yes.
He used the word heinous himself.
Yes. And do you think that there was a sense in Eliot that we might see as readers of an unresolved or unforgiven past?
Yes, absolutely. An unforgiving of self, but founded on an unforgivingness of others. Two lots of sins are meeting, so to speak, in a dark fetus. Because he had both. He couldn't forgive himself, but that non-forgiveness of self sprang from a non-forgiveness of others. Because a baby doesn't bawl and burst into the world with an it bawls for milk and touch.
Yes, indeed.
It doesn't know about unforgiveness yet. It learns that, alas, from elders.
You deploy a beautiful quote in the lecture from George Herbert, and so in age I bud again.
George Herbert said,
yes. Yes, indeed, and one could easily apply that to you, if you'll forgive me. Here on your birthday, it was you that mentioned being born in 1930, so for our audience, this is your 90th birthday, and I look at that quote and I see you budding again, and I think, is there a sense in which the creative urgency, the sense of still having things to say, still having poets to interpret and to learn from, is still very much there for you?
I want to very much. The divide between the wish and even the will to doing and the doing is much harder for me. As regards looking, see me the day after 90, and I won't look as well. I have made some effort today, some effort with the help of others, as Blanche Dubois might put it. But in terms of future work, I long more than anything. I have always longed for words. I have loved words, words that I saw in others, both in daily life, because some Irish people, in fact, a lot of Irish people have a great gift of fluency and language. Words as I came to read them in the Gospels, in prayer books, and ultimately in James Joyce. That's a three good batch to put together. I love when I manage to bring a few words together on the page and to rewrite them and rewrite them and rewrite them. And no matter what one has done in the past, whether it's middling or good, there is in one, there is in me, the desire, the purpose and the will to write. And I even say to my maker, just one book more, because without those words and without the doing of them, and even the pain of them, and that must never be omitted, I would be a very lonely woman.
And just finally, Edna, given that T.S. Eliot is our occasion today, has your view of the poetry and of the experience and of the insights contained in that work changed over the decades? because here we are looking back, if you like, at a life and a body of work which is simply perhaps the most influential of any single poet of the 20th century. Yes. But in your life, has the feeling for that poetry, as you've lived more and perhaps learned more and perhaps suffered more?
Feeling has intensified more, and the feeling has deepened. The feeling has in no way lessened for his poetry. Some poems I find have more, give me a greater shudder, which is something I love literature to do, with that shudder that you are reading or rereading something well nigh impossible to write or to give the word to. The feeling for different verses or sections or whatever the word for his poems have changed. Parts of Wasteland that moved me more when I read them first moved me less now, and other parts moved me more.
And the four quartets?
Four quartets, I have more, being old, as you had to mention, and I have I have to endure. I mean, in life I have to endure. Four quartets resonates much more with me than it did when I first read it. That's why I mentioned that I thought just for them to be mentioned, to be often as at funerals and memorials, you know, times of death, is to gentrify them and is a reduction of them. Because always, at what age, even my grandson Oscar, only age 5, is dimly aware. We won't use copulation. I think that would be going too far. But dimly aware of birth and death. He cuts his finger and he thinks he's dying. Or, you know, your daughter, anyone's child. So those qualities that Eliot knew of, and not only knew of, but in a way, in a difficult penitential way, nourished within himself, increased with time and with his poetry. And therefore the reader of his poems, you, me, or anyone else here in this audience, the rereading of any great work is what matters. And the rereading of Eliot matters greatly.
Edna, thank you so much.
Ah, my love.
I'd like to thank the T.S. Eliot Estate for sponsoring us, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.